So hello friends, my name is Nikhil, and today I'm going to tell you a story which will make you think. So let's start. The year was 1980, and the normally peaceful cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, were about to experience one of the most disturbing crime sprees in their history. Residents felt safe walking through neighborhoods, parks, and city streets, believing that violent crimes of such brutality were rare. But that sense of security would soon disappear. During the early summer of 1980, a mysterious predator began stalking young women late at night. He chose victims who were alone and vulnerable, often approaching them without warning. His attacks were sudden, violent, and carefully timed, leaving investigators with very few clues to follow. Witnesses were scarce, forensic technology was still limited, and the killer seemed to vanish into the darkness after every assault. The first known victim was a young woman whose life was tragically cut short in Minneapolis. When police officers arrived at the crime scene, they found very little physical evidence that could identify the attacker. There were no fingerprints that could be matched, no surveillance cameras to review, and no eyewitnesses who had clearly seen the killer. Detectives immediately realized they were dealing with someone who was cautious and difficult to track. However, what happened after the murder shocked everyone involved in the investigation. Only a short time after the crime, emergency dispatchers received a phone call unlike anything they had ever heard before. The man on the other end of the line sounded terrified. His voice trembled uncontrollably, and he was crying so intensely that it was difficult to understand his words. Between loud sobs, he directed officers to the exact location where the victim's body could be found. At first, the dispatcher believed the caller might be a traumatized witness who had accidentally discovered the crime scene. But as the conversation continued, something felt deeply unsettling. The caller seemed to know details that only the killer or someone directly involved could possibly know. His emotional breakdown sounded genuine, yet there was something strangely theatrical about it. The crying appeared exaggerated, almost as if it were part of a performance. Before investigators could gather more information or trace the call, the caller abruptly hung up. Police rushed to the location he had described. Everything the caller had said was accurate. The victim's body was exactly where he claimed it would be. Investigators were stunned. It was almost unheard of for a murderer to voluntarily contact police immediately after committing such a brutal crime. Most killers did everything possible to avoid detection, but this man had deliberately reached out to authorities. News of the bizarre phone call quickly spread throughout Minneapolis. Local newspapers and television stations reported that an unknown man had contacted police while sobbing uncontrollably after the murder. The chilling recording of his trembling voice fascinated both detectives and the public. Reporters soon gave the mysterious suspect a nickname that would follow him forever: the Weepy-Voiced Killer. The name perfectly captured the strange contradiction that defined the unknown murderer. He sounded heartbroken and remorseful, yet he was responsible for an act of horrifying violence. His voice conveyed fear and sadness, but his actions revealed cold calculation. Criminal psychologists later suggested that the phone calls may have served multiple purposes. On one hand, they appeared to express guilt or emotional instability. On the other, they gave the killer exactly what he wanted: attention. Every call guaranteed that police, reporters, and the public would focus on him. He controlled the narrative while remaining hidden in the shadows. Unlike many serial offenders who tried to erase every trace of their crimes, this killer seemed almost eager to insert himself into the investigation. He wanted detectives to hear his voice. He wanted newspapers to write about him. And, perhaps most disturbingly, he wanted people to remember him. As fear spread across Minneapolis, young women became increasingly cautious about walking alone at night. Families warned their daughters to avoid isolated streets, and police increased patrols throughout the city. Yet despite these efforts, the identity of the emotional caller and the murderer behind the voice remained a complete mystery.
The terrifying phone call marked only the beginning of a case that would grow darker with every passing month. Investigators had a haunting voice to remember, but they still had no face, no name, and no clear path to finding the man who had become known as the Weepy-Voiced Killer.
As 1980 came to an end, fear had already taken hold in Minneapolis, but the nightmare was far from over. Instead of disappearing, the mysterious murderer expanded his hunting grounds into neighboring St. Paul, proving that no part of the Twin Cities was truly safe. Residents who once felt comfortable walking home after dark suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, locking their doors earlier than ever, and warning loved ones to avoid traveling alone at night. For investigators, the case became increasingly frustrating. The killer seemed to appear without warning, strike quickly, and vanish before police could respond. Every new attack deepened the mystery surrounding the man known only by the haunting sound of his trembling voice. Throughout 1981, the attacks became more frequent. The killer grew noticeably more confident, choosing women who were walking alone during the late evening or early morning hours. He appeared to study his surroundings carefully, selecting moments when his victims were isolated and unlikely to receive immediate help. His crimes were swift and violent, leaving detectives with few clues and many unanswered questions. Each new attack sent another wave of panic through the community. Local news stations interrupted regular programming with crime updates. Newspapers filled their front pages with warnings, and radio broadcasts urged women to avoid walking alone after sunset. Parents worried about daughters returning from work or college, while friends insisted on accompanying one another home. The fear was no longer limited to one neighborhood. It had spread across the entire metropolitan area. Behind the scenes, investigators faced another serious obstacle. The crimes were occurring in both Minneapolis and St. Paul, two cities with separate police departments and different investigative procedures. At the time, sharing information between jurisdictions was slower and far less efficient than it is today. Detectives often worked with separate files, separate evidence, and separate witness interviews. Although everyone believed the same offender was responsible, coordinating the investigations proved difficult. This lack of communication unintentionally worked in the killer's favor. While investigators tried to connect the evidence, the murderer continued moving between cities, exploiting the gaps in the system. Valuable time was lost as detectives attempted to compare reports, interview witnesses, and determine whether each attack was connected. The elusive predator remained one step ahead. Yet the most disturbing aspect of the case was not just the murders, it was the phone calls. After several attacks, the killer again contacted authorities. Dispatchers recognized the now familiar trembling voice. He cried so hard that his words were often interrupted by loud sobs and heavy breathing. At times, he sounded as though he were completely overwhelmed by guilt. "I'm sorry. Please, forgive me." The caller repeatedly begged police to forgive him. Between sobs, he claimed that he never wanted to hurt anyone. He insisted that he felt compelled to kill, as though some invisible force was controlling his actions. His emotional pleas painted the picture of a deeply disturbed man trapped in a cycle of violence. But investigators remained skeptical. Experienced detectives believed the tears were part of a carefully crafted performance. Although the caller sounded remorseful, he continued attacking innocent women. His actions consistently contradicted his words. If he truly wanted to stop, he could have surrendered to police at any time. Instead, he chose to remain anonymous while terrifying an entire region. Criminal profilers later suggested that the calls revealed a complicated personality. The killer appeared desperate for attention and recognition, using the phone to place himself at the center of the investigation. Every emotional confession guaranteed more media coverage, more public fear, and more pressure on law enforcement. His voice became one of the most recognizable pieces of evidence in the case. Citizens who heard recordings of the calls described them as chilling and unforgettable. Some believed the man sounded genuinely broken, while others thought his crying was nothing more than manipulation. Either way, the mysterious caller succeeded in creating an image unlike that of any other serial killer in American history. As 1981 progressed, police knew they were dealing with someone who was becoming increasingly dangerous. The attacks were escalating, the phone calls continued, and the killer remained unidentified. The Twin Cities were living in fear, and investigators realized that unless they found the man behind the trembling voice, more innocent lives could be lost.
By the beginning of 1982, the Weepy-Voiced Killer had become one of the most feared criminals in the Twin Cities. For nearly 2 years, he had managed to evade capture while spreading fear across Minneapolis and St. Paul. Detectives worked tirelessly to identify him, but every lead seemed to end in frustration. As the investigation intensified, the killer's behavior became even more disturbing. His phone calls were no longer limited to reporting crimes or expressing apparent remorse. Investigators began to suspect that he was using the calls as a way to monitor and manipulate the police response. By contacting dispatchers, he could learn how authorities reacted, how quickly they responded, and what information they already possessed. Some calls contained real details about crimes, while others included misleading information. On several occasions, the caller provided confusing statements or vague clues that led investigators in the wrong direction. Detectives were forced to spend valuable time sorting through information that often turned out to be useless. Many officers came to believe that the killer enjoyed the confusion he created. Every false lead generated additional paperwork, interviews, and searches. While police chased one possibility, the real offender remained hidden. The calls allowed him to feel connected to the investigation while maintaining complete control over his identity. Meanwhile, law enforcement launched one of the largest manhunts in the region's history. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people and examined countless tips from the public. Local drifters, former offenders, acquaintances of victims, and numerous other suspects were questioned. Detectives reviewed criminal records, followed anonymous tips, and compared witness statements from multiple jurisdictions. Despite their efforts, the Weepy-Voiced Killer remained little more than a voice on the telephone. Witness descriptions varied widely. Some people reported seeing suspicious individuals near crime scenes, but none of the accounts provided enough information for a positive identification. Without modern DNA databases and advanced surveillance technology, investigators faced enormous challenges. The killer seemed almost invisible. Yet, unknown to him, his luck was beginning to run out. During one of his attacks, a targeted woman refused to become another victim. Instead of surrendering, she fought back with determination and courage. In the struggle, she managed to injure her attacker before escaping. The incident deeply affected the killer. Not long afterward, police dispatchers received another familiar call. Once again, the man was crying uncontrollably. His voice shook as he spoke through heavy sobs. But this time, the focus of his emotional breakdown was different. Instead of talking primarily about the victim, he complained about his own injuries. Between sobs, he described how badly he was hurt and how much he was bleeding. He sounded frightened and distressed, almost as if he expected sympathy from the very people trying to arrest him. To investigators, the call revealed something important. The supposedly powerful predator was not invincible. For the first time, there was evidence that victims could resist and survive. More importantly, the attacker had suffered injuries that might eventually help identify him. Then came the incident that would ultimately change the course of the entire investigation. In 1982, the killer targeted a young woman named Denise Williams. Like many of his previous victims, she was alone when the attack began. The killer believed he had found another easy target. Instead, he encountered someone who refused to give up. As the struggle intensified, Williams fought with extraordinary courage. She desperately searched for anything she could use to defend herself. During the confrontation, she managed to grab a screwdriver and strike her attacker. The blow caused significant injuries and caught the killer completely by surprise.
For a moment, the balance of power shifted. Rather than continuing the assault, the wounded attacker panicked. Realizing that he had lost control of the situation, he abandoned the attack and fled the scene. Williams survived. Her bravery accomplished something that countless police officers had been unable to achieve. She wounded the elusive predator and forced him into retreat. The attack on Denise Williams left investigators hopeful that the killer's injuries might finally expose his identity. Hospitals, clinics, and emergency rooms became areas of interest as detectives considered the possibility that the wounded man would eventually seek medical treatment. For the first time since the murders began, police felt they were closing in on the mysterious voice that had haunted the Twin Cities. The Weepy-Voiced Killer had spent years hiding behind telephone calls, tears, and false leads. But after the attack on Denise Williams, he had made a serious mistake. And that mistake would soon bring detectives closer than ever to uncovering the man behind the voice.
The failed attack on Janae marked the turning point investigators had been hoping for. For nearly 2 years, the mysterious murderer had managed to escape after every assault, leaving behind little physical evidence and taunting police with his emotional phone calls. But this time, everything had gone wrong for him. During the struggle, Williams had fought with extraordinary courage, striking her attacker several times with a screwdriver. The wounds were serious enough that the killer could not simply ignore them. He was bleeding heavily, in pain, and desperate for medical treatment. Instead of disappearing into the night, as he had done so many times before, the injured attacker made a decision that would ultimately end his freedom. In a state of panic, Stephanie drove himself to a local hospital to have his wounds treated. He hoped the medical staff would simply stitch his injuries and send him on his way without asking too many questions. When he arrived, doctors and nurses immediately noticed that something seemed unusual. Stephanie had several fresh puncture wounds and cuts that appeared consistent with someone who had recently been involved in a violent struggle. His injuries did not match his explanation he gave hospital staff. As medical personnel questioned him, his story changed, and parts of his account became inconsistent. The staff grew increasingly suspicious. Hospitals are trained to recognize injuries that may be connected to violent crimes, and Stephanie's behavior raised numerous red flags. He appeared nervous, anxious, and uncomfortable whenever questions became more detailed. The more he spoke, the less believable his explanation became. One hospital employee realized that the circumstances were too suspicious to ignore. Quietly and without alerting Stephanie, the employee contacted the police and explained that a man with unexplained stabbing injuries had arrived seeking treatment. Considering the recent attack on Denise Williams, officers immediately recognized the possibility that this patient might be connected to the investigation. Police quickly responded to the hospital. When detectives arrived, they carefully observed the injured man before speaking with him. As they questioned Stephanie, several details caught their attention. His appearance, his age, his behavior, and even his manner of speaking closely matched the psychological profile investigators had developed over months of investigation. Still, one crucial question remained. Was this frightened hospital patient truly the mysterious Weepy-Voiced Killer? Investigators already possessed one of the most unusual pieces of evidence ever collected in a serial murder case: recordings of the anonymous phone calls made by the killer himself. Those chilling recordings had been replayed countless times as detectives searched for any clue that might reveal the caller's identity. Now they had a chance to compare that voice with the man sitting in front of them. Officers who had spoken directly with Stephanie listened carefully as he answered questions. Detectives then replayed the recorded emergency calls made by the Weepy-Voiced Killer. The reaction was immediate. The trembling tone, the distinctive speech patterns, the emotional delivery, and the unmistakable sound of the voice matched perfectly. Officers who heard both recordings had little doubt they were listening to the same person. The voice that had haunted Minneapolis and St. Paul for years finally had a face.
For investigators, it was an unforgettable moment. The anonymous caller who had cried, begged for forgiveness, and taunted police over the telephone was no longer an invisible shadow. Standing before them was Paul Michael Stephanie, the man they believed was responsible for the terrifying series of attacks. After years of fear, frustration, and countless dead ends, detectives finally had the breakthrough they needed. The bizarre phone calls that Stephanie believed had given him power over the investigation ultimately became the evidence that helped him identify him. His own voice, once his greatest weapon of manipulation, had become one of the strongest links connecting him to the crimes. The long hunt for the Weepy-Voiced Killer was nearing its dramatic conclusion, and investigators were finally preparing to bring one of Minnesota's most elusive murderers to justice.
After years of terror, the investigation into the Weepy-Voiced Killer had finally reached its climax. Once Stephanie was identified and taken into custody, detectives began the difficult process of questioning the man whose trembling voice had haunted the Twin Cities for years. At first, Stephanie attempted to explain away the evidence against him. However, as investigators confronted him with the growing number of facts linking him to the crimes, including his injuries after the attack on Shea, witness testimony, and the recordings of the infamous emergency phone calls, his carefully constructed facade began to collapse. The emotional mask that had confused investigators for years could no longer protect him. During lengthy interviews, Stephanie admitted responsibility for a series of violent attacks and murders. As he described the crimes, detectives noticed something unsettling. He often spoke with the same trembling voice and emotional tone that had made his anonymous phone calls so infamous. At times, he appeared to cry while recalling the attacks, yet his detailed descriptions revealed the deliberate actions of someone who had repeatedly targeted vulnerable women. Investigators found the contrast deeply disturbing. The man who had begged for forgiveness over the telephone was the very person responsible for causing unimaginable pain to victims and their families. His apparent remorse did not erase the suffering he had inflicted, nor did it change the evidence gathered against him. As the case moved to court, it attracted enormous public attention. Newspapers across Minnesota closely followed every stage of the proceedings, while families of the victims hoped the trial would finally bring justice after years of fear and uncertainty. During the trial, Stephanie's defense team argued that he suffered from severe mental illness. They suggested that psychological problems affected his behavior and attempted to portray him as a man whose emotional instability played a significant role in the crimes. Prosecutions presented a very different picture. Rather than seeing Stephanie as someone who had completely lost control of his actions, they argued that he was capable of making deliberate decisions. They pointed out that he selected victims who were alone, fled after attacks, attempted to avoid identification, and repeatedly contacted police in ways that kept public attention focused on himself. According to the prosecution, the emotional phone calls were not evidence of innocence or helplessness. Instead, they argued that the calls allowed Stephanie to manipulate investigators, frighten the public, and place himself at the center of one of the greatest murder investigations in Minnesota history. After hearing the testimony, reviewing the evidence, and considering the arguments from both sides, the jury found Paul Michael Stephanie guilty of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The verdict marked the end of a terrifying chapter in the history of Minneapolis and St. Paul. The judge sentenced Stephanie to 40 years in prison, ensuring that he would spend decades behind bars for the violence he had inflicted upon innocent victims. For the survivors and the families of those who had been killed, the sentence brought a measure of justice, even though it could never undo the tragedy they had endured. Stephanie remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. In 1998, he died in prison, bringing a permanent end to one of the most unusual criminal cases in American history.
The story of the Weepy-Voiced Killer continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and investigators because of the extraordinary contradiction at its center. Stephanie did not fit the typical image of a silent serial killer who avoided all contact with authorities. Instead, he repeatedly inserted himself into the investigation through emotional telephone calls, crying, apologizing, and pleading for forgiveness while continuing to commit horrific acts of violence. Many experts believe those calls reflected a powerful desire for attention and recognition. Whether his tears were genuine expressions of guilt, a form of emotional manipulation, or a combination of both remains a subject of debate. What is certain is that the same voice he used to seek sympathy ultimately became one of the most memorable pieces of evidence in the case. Today, the Weepy-Voiced Killer case serves as a reminder that appearances and emotions can be deeply misleading. A man who sounded broken and remorseful on the telephone was capable of extraordinary violence, leaving behind a legacy of fear that lasted for years. Most importantly, the case is remembered not because of the killer's strange behavior, but because of the victims whose lives were forever changed. Their stories and the courage shown by survivors such as Denise Williams remain the true legacy of a case that shocked Minnesota and continues to be studied decades later. And with this, our story ends. If you liked the story, then like it and subscribe to hear more such stories.